Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of Chatting the Pictures. I'm Cara Finnegan. I'm a writer, teacher, and historian of photography.
And I'm Michael Shaw. I'm the publisher of Reading the Pictures.
Okay, so Michael, is this week tricks or treats? What do you think?
It, I'm feeling better than last week when we were talking about the photos being completely co-opted by politics and by the president. So things seem to shift a little bit this week. So I'm feeling a little better.
Yeah,
Tricks
that's
or treats?
interesting.
I don't know about. I don't have an answer to your question.
Well, we hope to be a treat to those who take the time to watch us. Maybe we'll
Uh,
just say
there you go.
that. And hopefully not too tricky. Yeah. Um, Uh, so if folks have watched before, you know that we have three segments in each episode of Chatting the Pictures, and the first segment we call the news, and that is a segment where we choose a photo that helps us talk about the question: how do news photos tell a story? And here is this week's selection.
So the first image was on the cover of the Financial Times, British publication. The photo is by Rose Marie Cromwell, and the caption reads, Democratic candidate Andrew Gillum hugs a supporter at a rally in Siesta Key. He's the Democratic challenger in the governor's race in Florida. One quick thing is that it feels like every major news story and photo that we've been looking at for weeks is about the election, but in an inferential way, whether we're talking about pictures of the caravan or domestic terrorism, the pipe bombing and the horrific shooting in Pittsburgh, which we'll look at a picture from there in a second. But we haven't seen that many prominent election photos. And so it's really interesting to see this one. And it's interesting that it came from other side of the pond.
Yeah, that was something that really stuck out to me as well. And so when I first looked at this this cover photo, my first thought was blue wave, blue hug. Thinking about the sort of shorthand that we've developed for thinking about what is the future of the Democratic Party, and then extending that to your point about how this is an international publication. In some ways, I wondered if this photo embodied a kind of wish. Like, please, America, get it together, right? We would wish that when America votes, certain things will happen.
As we go over the cliff with Brexit.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And so, so I think those were my first two thoughts. And then my final thought was Democrats need white women. This is Andrew Gillum hugging a supporter who appears to be a white woman. And boy, wasn't that the post-2016 story, right?
Yeah.
And where did the white women go? And if these white women in Florida can come back, if they went away, that's huge politically.
Yeah, it's really, actually, that's pretty interesting how the photograph then becomes almost a demographic roadmap or something. I was interested in the role of color. And since Trump got elected, Obama was so much about words and so much about intellect and ideas. And then now things have become much cruder and it's more about gesture and the whole thing about the color red and the red hats. So this is really quite a statement too. And as you said, there's a really interesting point about maybe it's like a wish too, but blue wave, the blue hats. And then also, America has been so much characterized with all this nationalism in terms of being, this white nation. So it's like you've got the black and brown versus white, and his T-shirt is white, which is so there's a whole lot of shifting in terms of hues.
Yeah, just that juxtaposition of the blue hat, red hat, right? I was thinking, is that a Dr. Seuss book or something, right? about blue socks or red socks or something. People who have better
One
memories.
fish, two fish, red fish,
Red
blue
fish,
fish.
blue fish, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so something like that. Yeah, right. So in other words, it's this kind of point counterpoint, but then there's also, I think, like you said, there this is a moment of interracial interaction, gendered interaction, and also I think because we don't see the woman's face, it's also that sense of he's hugging a voter, right? Rather than a particular person, because she's faceless to us, she can kind of stand in for, like I said, the Democrats need white women, or kind of however that plays out.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also a kind of, I don't know, I mean, maybe the international narrative too might be kind of like a longing for Obama. I don't know, right? So we have another young, charismatic, up and coming, African American politician, activist. You can imagine that might appeal across borders as well, if people are have a lot of anxiety about what's happening in our nation right now.
Wow, there's so many subtexts here. Then I was thinking about the post-Kavanaugh hearing, and Me Too, and it's a little bit like, we're sorry, or welcome, come back, or or someone needs a hug.
Right. Yeah, and then there is also just that sense of the emotional component, right? It's not an aggressive photograph. It is a kind of warm, welcoming, kind of context that's playing out. And
Uniting,
yeah, I think that's really interesting too. Yeah. And then the blue sky, it's mostly sunny. There's a little gray. I don't know, if you want to we could extend the narrative outward, but yeah, there's a kind of blue wish. If I were going to give this photo a caption, I would call it the blue wish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Shall we move on?
Sure.
Okay, so our next segment we call The Look. And this is the space in every episode where we ask ourselves questions about how photos in this week's news might be pushing the visual boundaries in order to illuminate a particular story or idea. And here is this week's image.
The photo was taken by Brendan Smielowski for AFP Getty. The caption reads, "People arrived to pay their respects in front of a memorial on October 28th outside the Tree of Life Synagogue after a shooting there left 11 people dead in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh on October 27th. We're talking about a gaze again. And that was great, your elaboration of that gaze photo, I think it was last week. And I think this is also like a commentary on the spectacle. When you look at that expression of this woman, I think it also is a commentary a little bit on media and, if just the very top level of having, a camera in her face during, this moment. But I think that gaze is a little bit like, really feels like, hey, this, you could be in my shoes right now. This really could be any of us.
Yeah, there's a weariness, but there's also a kind of acknowledgement, I guess, right? Like, you're here, I'm here, as well. Yeah, I think.
And maybe almost a shaming, it's like, the look also has a little bit of like, when is it enough?
Yeah,
maybe that's my Bubba talking or something. And
yeah, exactly. And the first thing I thought when I looked at this image was the women always do the mourning, and that's a little bit disingenuous because obviously everyone is mourning and there are men visible in the background of the photo, etc. But the way this photo is composed, you really just have faces of different generations of women. And apart from the woman who is gazing right back at us, the other women in the photo, they're, the younger woman or girl looking down, I assume maybe is a candle in her hand or flowers. The woman with the Kleenex, who's clearly, kind of probably openly weeping. The taller woman with the purple flowers. they're almost like self-contained units where it's like they're not even necessarily in the same place, and in that sense of, and what's interesting to me about that is that that's sort of what mourning can be like. You're isolated and you're kind of within yourself at the same time that you're with this group of people who are sharing something of the same experience. And it just hit me that, the way the photograph is composed, I think, especially with the various faces in the foreground, really kind of highlighted that for me, that sense of kind of being alone in your thoughts and your feelings at the same time that you're in a crowd.
Yeah. I mean, it was very, very difficult to pick a photograph to talk about from the synagogue shooting. And I was trying to figure out, and this is in this more aesthetic category and not in the news category, I was trying to figure out why that was. I mean, I think that one thing that makes this photo, if we're talking about gun violence, distinctive, or this event distinctive, is that it was an attack on Jews, and it was an act of anti-Semitism, and there's been a lot spoken about that. But a lot of the news photos, are taken outside of the synagogue, and you see Jewish stars, and you see the, and you see the temple, and then you'll see like people in different kinds of garb, but it just didn't feel like it was getting at it. And so, and I don't know if this photo does too, but it is kind of, in the very far background, you do see a man facing the other direction. He's wearing a yarmulke. Mm-hmm. This woman, if you are Jewish, I think this would feel like your aunt, or a sister, or someone that you know. But I don't know. This was really frustrating. It's hard to find a photo that even spoke to the anti-Semitism, or spoke to gun violence in a particular way. It seems like this gaze was doing more than photos that were calling out those other aspects, which are really critical aspects.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I wonder too if part of that is that the symbolism can be so overwrought. So you mentioned, right, that, photographs obviously made outside of the synagogue or showing the Jewish star, and all of the kind of symbolism. And here the symbols are more almost kind of universal symbols of mourning: the candle, the flowers, even the woman with the Kleenex, right? The Kleenex as a kind of, visual cue to sadness or grief. So, and maybe that's part of the narrative. And then the yarmulke in the very background kind of punctuates that. And so, what's distinctive about this shooting versus what's universal, and maybe the photos are kind of playing that back and forth a little bit. I don't know. That's a really interesting point. I also just want to point out the other thing I think that, thinking about how this photograph visually invites us to think about some of these questions. It's just the color, and we're at a time of year and it was a rainy day, I believe, rainy over the weekend in Pittsburgh too, and so the sky is gray, the trees are sort of blown out, things are somber, people are dressed in heavier clothes, but then you've got these little punctuations of color, the flame of the candle. So to me that also has a kind of universal component, really. But it's that woman's gaze, right? And the fact that she's not entirely in focus, I think, is also interesting. Mm-hmm. And so she kind of juxtaposes with the woman behind her, who's in the middle of the frame, the woman with the Kleenex.
And if you go back, and I think that was really good in terms of it capturing a tone and a mood, and a larger tone and mood. And then if you go back to the first picture, and I was thinking about it, and you were talking about that being kind of a wish. You really do see this helps us understand the contrast and how much the country really is the cost of this division and the depression, and of course the literal cost in terms of if you ascribe to the idea that fomenting all this hate has these literal repercussions. So there you see between the first two pictures where we are right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. and what I don't know, the wish and the reality maybe. It seems kind of stark to put it that way, but yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And then, now if we move on to the last photo, that
Oh
also
boy.
sort of extends the question a little bit of where we are. And that would be our last segment that we call the pick, where we ask more of a kind of editorial question of what gives certain kinds of news photos particular traction in the public space.
Uh-huh. And this photo was taken by Nacho Doce for Reuters. It was taken October 28th. Caption reads, "Supporters of Jair Bolsonaro react during a runoff election in Sao Paulo." And we were just talking before for a minute. The gesture has become, or was during the campaign, a trademark for Bolsonaro and then for his followers. And for anyone who hasn't been following this or following it much, Bolsonaro is really an outright far right figure, openly like called a fascist by people. I don't think there's much refute to that. The public in Brazil was so fed up with crime and corruption, they turned to this far right radical. So a pretty interesting photograph, actually, in terms of characterizing the attitude down there, and also like maybe it's kind of in terms of the wish. Maybe this is where if things don't get better, it gets even more extreme here.
Yeah, and yeah, so many contrasts to the first image and that we talked about today, and then also contrast to the other image, primarily in the context of gender, right? So this is a bunch of men, first of all, and again, like with the previous image, we had the younger girl and then the older women, and here we have adult men and a child, and the child and the guy in the middle doing the finger guns, that kind of repeatable gesture, which in a little bit of my Googling I did earlier, there are GIFs featuring him, Bolsonaro, doing the finger guns. And so the finger guns are definitely a thing, as Michael pointed out. But they also have a kind of, they are pointed, I think, in literal and figurative ways here for reasons that you highlighted, Michael, in terms of Bolsonaro's politics. And so to have, those finger guns being pointed at you, the viewer, by his supporters, I think is a particularly aggressive stance that comes across in photos like this.
Uh-huh. It is interesting, like the comparison to Trump, and I think Bolsonaro said himself, he said, I think if the US elected a Trump, so can Brazil. And then when you just look at these gestures, and you get, it's not that far from this, to this.
Yeah.
So you get so many parallels like that. And then it's really interesting too, like when you look at the two men, it's almost like the two faces of a Bolsonaro or even a Trump, where you get that kind of more blatant, brash, aggressive one, and then you get also this kind of charismatic, ingratiating one. And the fact that the man on the right is wearing that yellow shirt, Bolsonaro's campaign appropriated, the yellow of Brazil and then the Brazilian colors. So, and then that and the way it parallels with a flag on the other man's shoulder, Trump tried to like kind of soften this use of nationalism, or at least kind of soft pedal it so it could have its sting, but also have some deniability around it. But, you start to see all these elements of nationalism, in these images and the clothing and the flags, and now it really sticks.
Yeah, and there's also a kind of a softer read that plays in perfectly to that harder read, which is also the culture of sport, right? Particularly in a place like Brazil. And so, is that, is that guy on the right just cheering at a football match, right? Doing his thing, dressing up in the flag and a shirt, running around screaming, cheering for the home team? Or is it something else? Or is it a kind of combination of both? And I think you see, just like there's that juxtaposition between the kind of two faces of Bolsonaro and these two adult men, you also see that juxtaposition. Well, it's fun, it's playful, we're the home team, and it's also kind of insidious and scary, and confrontational. I did look a little bit. I looked at a couple of the other images that Dose made of this small group of people, and it was interesting because it was clear that the guy in the middle was a performer. I mean, in the sense of like he was kind of doing his thing for this photographer, and I'm not saying in this kind of staged news way, but just the photos. There are a couple of photos. There's one where he's much more close up on the guy in the middle. And then the child is kind of standing in the background watching. And then there are a couple of others where, the child is kind of mimicking things as well. And so to me, that's interesting because, again, it shows, in the context of this political celebration and performance, there's also that component, right? Which is, I'm going to give this guy, something to take a picture of. I'm going to do the gesture. I'm going to make the performance, and then the kid's going to do it too. So there's, I think, that element as well.
And the kid it's so sad too, because, like one way to think about what's going on, whether it's domestically or internationally, is that, these figures, that you can think about it in terms of modeling. I'm more and more seeing these images of young people, and I've been, I guess, seeing it from the beginning of, when Trump won the nomination, even where the kids show up and they are wearing the suit and the tie and the white shirt, and look at this kid's face. I mean, it's one thing to like be able to, shift the tide, in the country, but what's the lasting consequences in terms of the modeling?
Yeah. And so you get that generational component, right? So the mimicking, the putting, at what point is the putting on the gesture become, the beginning of something else, right? Which is a lot of the conversation we've been having this week about the violence and, to what extent do these kinds of political performances and political rhetoric, incite?
Yeah. Where does the rhetoric lead? Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, on that happy note, it's probably time for us to wrap up for this week. We have an election coming up next week, Michael. So this will be, I assume there will be visual components that we'll talk about at a later date.
It should be pretty interesting. I'm looking forward to just like what it looks like, let alone the results. But
yeah.
We also now, I think I mentioned last week, we have a salon scheduled looking at the visualization of the border wall and the caravan and zero tolerance. That's coming up on December 6th. We're getting our marketing out, so we'll have links and people can sign up for that. Otherwise, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and come onto our website and sign up for our mailing list.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really great event. And so we hope people will check it out. And then we hope that you will join us next time we're here. Thanks so much.
Take care.